Hello and welcome back with the newest edition of my latest records purchases or new old records videos. I was in a Neil Young mood in recent weeks, so I bought lots of mostly even classic Neil Young albums. Some really big works in his career, but also two others I want to mention that I came across. First, Nick Drake, Brighter Lighter. I was never really a fan of Nick Drake, but this is like a completion thing, like completing certain aspects of the record collection. I was never really a fan of Nick Drake. The only other album of his that I listened to many years ago was I think that's his most famous album, Pink Moon, and I didn't like it at all. That was one of those moments when you listen for the first time to an artist and you listen to an album classic everybody raves about and you expect a lot and then you're disappointed. So I thought, now years later, I thought like maybe my expectations were so high that I didn't really give him a fair chance, and I heard over the years that this is the other kind of big masterpiece of his 3 or 4 albums. So I thought with fresh ears and with almost no recollections of the Pink Moon album that really didn't make a lasting impression on me, I have to say. Let's listen to this one. And I think it's okay. Now that I didn't expect too much, I came away from it with thinking it's okay. But I think he's like this typical sad, depressed, rich kid, dabbling with mostly jazzy folk songwriting and interesting chords and this very depressing atmosphere in a way. And I also can think of it, I think that was his intention, to come across like that, and he was obviously a depressed soul, but also it's the kind of music that nowadays I can really envision, in coffee houses, like this chilling mood music, and it's not really for me. And it's really strange saying that when I told you I'm in a Neil Young phase, because I read biographies about Neil Young's life, and I'm aware that in a way he's also kind of a rich kid. His father was a very successful writer, journalist, I think, in Canada. But it's a different kind of thing. With Neil Young, he comes across as an outlaw, and I believe him this outlaw romanticism. So it's a completely different vibe with Neil Young. Another record I bought that's not Neil Young and that's very different. Nick Drake. You could envision a record collection where someone has Nick Drake next to Neil Young, but this artist is very different. Kettle of Fish, Neneh Cherry. I think that's her debut album. At least that's the big breakthrough album from I think 1989 with Buffalo Stance and Man-Child. Great. What do you call it? Late 80s, early 90s R&B, soul music with hip hop elements. I can see why this was why this album is so hailed, and why she for a short time became like the next big thing. She really couldn't confirm this status with her next albums, although I think in the mid-90s she had 1 or 2 hits. I think something like Man's World or something like that was also a hit. But this is really an enjoyable album, but of course completely different from the main subject of today's video, which is Neil Young. This is one album I bought now on vinyl. I have the CD version since I'm 10 years old, so for a very long time. This is one of my all-time favorite albums of all time by anyone, and it's in my top 2 favorite Neil Young albums. So I'm very familiar with the album, of course. I'm even familiar with the vinyl version because my father used to have it. I don't know what happened to that copy. Maybe he sold the copy before he passed away. My father died in 2013 and I inherited most of his records, but this wasn't amongst the records, so maybe he gave it away shortly before he died or something. But I remember this as a vinyl record in the household since I'm a child, and I love this record. Then, I'm familiar with older records because in the illegal download time in like around the year 2005, 6, 7, 8, when I downloaded illegally the catalogs of some of my favorite artists, I also once downloaded the complete discography as of then by Neil Young. So I'm familiar with those albums as MP3s, as shitty MP3s. But now, now on vinyl, that's of course something different, a different listening experience. But I just wanted to say I know all the songs and the albums I'm showing here. This is the debut album, by Neil Young from the 60s. Still very psychedelic, still very Buffalo Springfield-like. He hasn't yet found, if there's even such a thing as a Neil Young style. There isn't really one Neil Young style. But there's only this album in his discography that sounds like that has influences like that, except of course the Buffalo Springfield albums, as I just said. So this is a very interesting outlier, and still it already has some kind of Neil Young classics like the Loner, for example. So the DNA is already here, of course, but it's he's still trying out things that he maybe wouldn't try out after that ever again. So very interesting album, also very underrated in his catalog, I would say. This is probably I think I will do the complete discography ranking of Neil Young next year. That's also one of the reasons why I'm getting all those albums now, all the missing links in my collection. I think I will do a ranking of the complete discography video, so I don't want to spoil anything. But I'm pretty sure that the debut album will be in my top 10, and I think in most other Neil Young fans ranking videos I see it. It's maybe the only of the first 10 albums of his career that isn't in the top 15 in most people rankings, but I think I have it in my top 10. The next one most people probably have in the top 10, and now I'm stopping spoiling. I won't tell you if it's in my top 10 as well, but what I can tell you is I really love this album. It's a great album. It's one of the his comeback started here. Maybe the comeback started with the album before, which had the big hit Rocking in the Free World, but this was the comeback as an album, because the Freedom album with Keep on Rocking in the Free World, that was maybe a bit more about that song, but this was really when, as an album artist, he really came back with a masterpiece, and that's Ragged Glory from 1990. His second golden phase started around the time of Keep on Rocking in the Free World and this subsequent album. The first classic phase would be the complete 70s, and starting with Everybody Knows This Is Nowhere, and this is the second golden phase, which lasted for 7 or 8 years until the late 90s, I would say. Those are the two golden phases of Neil Young. This is when he became the so-called godfather of grunge, and this album is maybe very responsible for that nickname, because this is very grungy at the beginning of what would become known as grunge music. Then the album he did, I think immediately after that, 1 year after that, is again showing you the acoustic, the folky side of Neil Young. It's something like a zigzag tactic he had all through his career, that a loud distorted album and then an acoustic album, always switching from one to the other and back. Ragged Glory, a loud electric album with Crazy Horse. This is the acoustic version, and this is kind of a spiritual sequel to Harvest. Or I would say it's the third in a trilogy. I would say Harvest, Comes a Time, and these are to me that's a 3-part thing. And again, I shouldn't start spoiling my rankings, but again I have to say one of my all-time favorite Neil Young albums. I think it's rated very highly, but I think it's even slightly underrated, although I think most Neil Young fans have it in the top 10, top 15. I surely have it in my top 10, and I think it's maybe a bit underrated because of the big status that part 1, Harvest, from I think 1972 or 73 has, so that people assumed, this can't be as good as the first part, because the first part is so gigantic. It's like with Mike Oldfield, every second album he puts out since Tubular Bells is called Tubular Bells Volume 2, Volume 3, Volume 4, whatever. And no one expects those Part 2, Part 3, Part 4 albums to be anywhere as good as the first one. So it's like you curse yourself if you call your album, you know, like a big classic of yours from the past. But in this case, you know, I think this is almost as good, or maybe as good. Again, I'm not going to spoil it. Maybe as good as the big classic Harvest. You know, this is really one of the big, great albums Neil put out in the last 3 or 4. Now it's 4 decades. Then a bootleg, and this is not really a very good bootleg if you're a Neil Young fan. But I also came across this bootleg when I was buying all those Neil Young albums in one record shop. I saw this bootleg, and of course this is the one album of the albums I'm showing you today by Neil Young that I wasn't familiar yet before. The studio albums I knew from my illegal download days, and in the case of Rust Never Sleeps and 2 others, I knew them because I had them on other formats before. But this I didn't know. I knew songs because there's at least 1 or 2 on YouTube from this collaboration when they played together in like 2004, 2005. I think this was part of the presidential campaign. Who were they backing? Maybe John Kerry. I think those were like rallies for John Kerry, the Democrat candidate who lost out to probably George W. Bush. And I remember them doing Only Love Can Break Your Heart. I think that's on YouTube, and it's a great duet version of Paul and Neil doing this song. And I think they also covered Let It Be, and they called it Let It Be Carrie. But unfortunately both songs aren't on this bootleg, so I'm not really happy with that bootleg. You know, Only Love Can Break Your Heart in their version is brilliant, and Let It Be Carrie would have been nice to have, but they're not on there. And I have to say, the Neil songs they're doing on this album, on this bootleg, aren't really the best versions of those songs. You know, Only Love Can Break Your Heart would have been the highlight on side A. They're doing Harvest Moon from the album I just showed you, Heart of Gold, On the Way Home, Human Highway, Old King, all great songs, but not really the best versions. But side B is the Paul McCartney stuff, and that's really good, you know. As a Paul McCartney fan, and I'm an even bigger Paul McCartney fan than I'm a Neil Young fan, so this still was great for me to find this, because the Neil Young stuff is, the Paul McCartney stuff is awesome, you know. Acoustic cover of Drive My Car, you know, all the songs are acoustic. It's really interesting, an acoustic cover of Drive My Car. And Follow Me from Chaos and Creation, 1 year before that album came out. You know, that album was released in 2005, this is 2004. So a very early version of Follow Me. And it's really fantastic, you know, the Paul McCartney stuff, awesome on this album. And then 2 albums, then again 2 Neil Young official studio albums. One from the Ditch period, and the other not officially from the so-called Ditch period, but in a way also from the Ditch period. You know, it's one of those things when fans really are trying to put things in boxes, and they draw lines like this is from this period and this period. You know, those things are very transitional. There's not like Neil Young didn't sit in the studio even thinking about the Ditch period he's in, and he wasn't thinking like, now I'm ending my Ditch period and the next album is not the Ditch period, if you know what I mean. You know, those are the 2 albums, Tonight's the Night and Zuma, and officially, you know, it's just a made-up thing by fans. This isn't part of the Ditch trilogy, but you know, basically it's the same kind of thing, it's the same kind of sound, it's the same kind of subject matter in a way, and mood and vibe. So if there's such a thing as a Ditch phase, then this is part of the Ditch phase in my opinion. I think both are from the same year, 1975. And again, I'm familiar with both albums, once because of that illegal downloading thing, but also because I had them as a child on cassettes. You know, someone made me tapes of those albums. Someone transferred those from, I guess, CD or vinyl onto cassette. And I still can remember listening to, I don't have a cassette player anymore for decades now, but when I was like, even before I knew Rust Never Sleeps, I think even when I was like 8 or 9 years old, I constantly played the cassettes with those 2 albums. And such early memories with music, you know, they ingrain themselves into you. So obviously I'm very, very fond of these albums, and I probably can't think of these albums in an objective way, not remotely in an objective way, because listening to those on non-stop repeat that early on, when you don't really have like hundreds of albums in your collection, you have like, maybe I had like 8 Beatle albums and 10 other albums, and these were 2 of the 10 other albums I had on cassette. So of course I really love those albums, but I think also objectively, if there's such a thing as objectivity about pop music criticism, of course, even objectively, you know, most people would say those are 2 of his outstanding all-time masterpieces, and of course I agree. Those are fantastic albums. This maybe the darkest album he ever did, the most bitter, sarcastic, but in a strange way also fun. that's the magical, the strange thing about this album. This is really one of those strange magical albums that really do something with you if you really listen closely. You know, if you listen to it in the background, you probably think, what's that strange noisy shit? You know, if you don't listen closely to this is maybe one album you won't like at all. But if you're in the mood for that, this is an album that can make you feel better, but very dark and depressed at the same time, which is a strange, very strange thing that this album pulls off, and that's one of the reasons why this is one of the outstanding albums in his catalog, and maybe one of the all-time great albums, maybe. And this is maybe a bit more it's not really upbeat. It has Caught as the Killer, you know, and many songs in that vibe. And it's not that different from Tonight's Tonight, but maybe this is a bit more professional sounding, maybe a bit more hi-fi, but still it's a very grungy, raunchy kind of album. And you know, also the way that the cover artwork is scribbled, that's maybe an expression of how this sounds. Some people say this is a bad album cover, but I think it translates the mood of the music somehow, and also those like Native American kind of themes and nature and so on. So I think it's a very good album cover in the way that it represents the music. And again, fantastic album. Again, I'm not going to spoil how high I would have it in my ranking, because I think in this year, 2026, at one time I will do a Neil Young ranking, but it's such a vast catalog, and you know, those are all great albums that I showed you, but he also has a lot of stinkers, I have to say, in my opinion. You know, in the last 15 years, you know, his albums were like hit and miss, sometimes good, sometimes not so good, almost always 1 or 2 great songs on every album in the last 15 years, but maybe 1 or 2 really good albums only, and in the 80s were a bit a rough time for him. So it's not, if you have to listen to the complete discography for a ranking video, it's maybe not the most enjoyable experience, so I'm a bit afraid of that, but you know, it's one of the things I want to do this year, a Neil Young ranking. Thank you very much for watching. Until next time, goodbye.